So question 6 is a question on insulin and glucagon and type 2 diabetes and the regulation of blood glucose. So that is relevant to homeostasis, keeping our internal body conditions the same. And this part A is a beautiful question because it allows you just to pour out your knowledge about the negative feedback system that exists between glucagon and insulin in your body in order to keep the blood sugar concentrations the same. So describe how insulin and glucagon help to control blood sugar concentration in a healthy person. So the key here is to mention the fact that we have insulin and glucagon. Okay, and insulin is going to reduce blood sugar, blood glucose, and glucagon is going to raise blood glucose, and it is going to do that by causing the liver to take up glucose and turn it into glycogen, and glucagon is going to work by glycogen being converted to glucose and raising the blood sugar. Okay, and you can imagine here like a little child seesaw. Insulin levels will go up when you've just had a meal and you have high blood glucose concentration, and glucagon up when you have done some exercise or you use your blood glucose and there isn't much glucose in your blood. So that is the basis of the whole system, and then we would want to factor that into making sure we get 6 marks. So you can see here things to mention. So to start with, on the mark scheme, we've got insulin and glucagon, and the first thing is that they are released by the pancreas, which is a good point. If blood glucose levels are too high, insulin is produced, allowing glucose to move from the blood into the cells, or named, e.g. liver. Glucose is converted to glycogen. If blood glucose levels fall, glucagon is produced, released. Glycogen is converted to glucose, causing glucose to be released into the blood. Okay, so a little bit of a nice exam tip there. We've got the whole process there, but notice the fact that they specifically like the fact that you mentioned that the hormones are released by the pancreas. Okay, so what is type 2 diabetes? Well, this is the exact definition here we can use a mark scheme for. Diabetes that occurs when the body or cells do not respond, are less responsive to insulin. So 2 really nice questions there, which are definition questions or just going through the process. 7 good marks. The next part of this question is a graph question. So let me just make that a bit bigger. So body mass index, BMI, is a person's body weight divided by the square of his or her height. Graph 1 shows the relationship between BMI and the percentage probability of developing type 2 diabetes. So you can see here, BMI on the y-axis and percentage probability of developing type 2 diabetes. So you can see clearly that with a BMI of 35 or greater, you have got a much bigger chance of developing type 2 diabetes. Interestingly, that's higher in women at 35, and then going down to the lower BMIs, you obviously got less chance. So there's a trend increasing. Now, if it was to describe that for 1 mark, you would say as the BMI increases, the probability of developing type 2 diabetes increases. But they've suggested an explanation for the relationship. So we know, looking at the graph, that as BMI increases, the probability of developing type 2 diabetes increases. And an explanation for that is going to be the why that would happen. Okay? And so if we look at the mark scheme here, we can see what the board thinks is linked to BMI that causes type 2 diabetes. And you can see it says obesity or being overweight, being fat, is a significant risk factor for type 2 diabetes. So can you see underlined, the board is saying we want you in these questions to use the term risk factor. Okay, really good to see that. Okay, and so that will be exactly the same in your exam. If this comes up, you need to use risk factor and you need to use obesity, being overweight. Obviously, obesity is the better technical term. Okay, if we move on to the next question. Graph 2 shows the changes in the number of new cases of type 2 diabetes in the UK. So you can see here it started fairly level, and then it started going up in about 1996/7. Okay, and it's slightly tailed off from about 2001. Okay, if that was a described question, we would be outlining those with figures about how that's changed. But once again, they've asked, it's quite rare actually for them not to ask a described question, but they've offered 2 explanations. Explain the trends shown in graph 2. So in this, you're talking about time, in the modern era, and why we would have increased obesity, because we've already talked about obesity being a key factor in the first graph. So if we talk about obesity now, why effectively are people becoming more obese? And you can see here a bit of common sense, a bit of knowledge on the mark scheme. Change in diet, fast foods, less exercise, we've got a more sedentary lifestyle, cars, buses, less cycling routes, less cycling, less walking, which increases the chance of obesity, which we link back to the first graph. And then they talked about, which I quite like actually, this is another interesting thing, because I don't think I would have thought of this. If you look at this last part, which is a slight tailing off, you can see that would have carried on like that, but it's slightly tailed off there, means that there's actually been a reduction in the rate of type 2 diabetes. And it would be very easy just to concentrate on this part here and the fact that it had increased. Okay, but I quite like this as an interesting angle of where you can pick up another mark. They've talked about the increased awareness has helped to slow the increase. And so you can see from about 2001, we've got a slight slowing down of the increase. So classic question there. We've talked about knowledge in terms of insulin and glucagon. We've talked about reading graphs, making up theories about why the graph looks like that. And that's covered most of the disciplines, in fact, in that question that the board wants you to know. Okay, so that's a really good practice question. And that could transfer to any question in terms of knowledge and graphs, reading graphs, not describing in that particular question, but explaining graphs as well.